Hi, my name is Keith Odell, and this is for Music History 241 for the class from Edison to iPod. Today my presentation is on the 1981 album My Life in the Bush of Ghosts by Brian Eno and David Byrne. I'm sure most of you are familiar with both of those names. Brian Eno is a producer and a musician who's worked with several of the most famous bands in the world. David Byrne is the lead singer of the band The Talking Heads. Brian Eno and David Byrne first started working together in the late 70s in 1978 when Brian Eno started working as the producer for 3 Talking Heads albums. Between the Talking Heads albums Fear of Music in 1979 and Remain in Light in 1980, Eno and Byrne came together and started working on the collaborative album My Life in the Bush of Ghosts. Now, this album was one of the first instances of sampling in modern music and popular music. Although sampling is fairly commonplace now in hip-hop, electronic, and even rock acts, this was fairly revolutionary at the time. It drew upon previous experiments that both artists had worked on before, but had maybe not fully formed. The Talking Heads had put out several albums of rock and roll that were viewed through the lens of African rhythmic drumming and funk rhythms. Brian Eno had worked with the avant-garde composer John Hassell in merging Western culture with world music artifacts. So the backing tracks on My Life in the Bush of Ghosts basically draw upon these influences, where most of the tracks are kind of funk-based, or they're based around the heavy layering of African percussion, switching out regular drum kits with more unconventional instruments to just give them a different tone. On top of these tracks, what they would do is take samples from the radio, from other records, from tapes, and basically use these vocal samples that they had found as the lead vocal, as Eno put it, on top of these tracks. These samples were as diverse as Lebanese mountain singers, Algerian Muslims chanting, radio evangelists, and even on one track, an unidentified exorcist in New York City. Limited by technology at the time, there was no access to things like the very complex computers and samplers that we have available to us now, so it was very hard for them to sit there and nitpick and change and sync up these tracks together. Basically what they had to do was what they refer to as flying them in, where they would play 2 tape tracks simultaneously, one of the tapes containing the backing track, and then the other tape containing the vocal sample that they were hoping to sync up with the song. Whenever they reached a level of coherence, or as Byrne referred to it, serendipity with the tracks, they would take that as a take. There were several takes of some of these songs. There's a widely circulated bootleg of this album that has several different takes that are slightly different than what ended up on the original album, and this bootleg is almost the same fidelity and quality as the actual album itself. It's really debatable whether or not My Life in the Bush of Ghosts is an influential album, although it's one of the first albums to ever use sampling in any significant way. And while it used looping rhythms that weren't quite commonplace, that are now commonplace in a lot of electronic music, and it also merged Western music influences along with things like world music, African music, different types of music from other cultures. These were all relatively new things, but it's debatable whether or not other people had actually listened to this album and had actually been influenced in turning out other albums that had these qualities, in the late 80s or the early 90s. Even fans of their respective other projects, this album was not particularly well distributed. It was hard to find. It's an album that's grown more in discussion, in influence, probably in the later years, and more in retrospect, actually, than it was at the time. Now, basically, you had a lot of same things coming out around the same time that also were exploring these elements of new technology, so it is hard to argue that My Life in the Bush of Ghosts was this tremendously revolutionary album that changed the face of music. Early hip-hop culture was very prevalent at the time. using drum breaks from other albums to rap over. So there's an aspect of sampling right there. Um, Early house and early techno music were being developed in Chicago and Illinois, and these were more influenced by things like disco and German rock than they were by the experiments of Eno and Byrne. So it stands to reason that while this album may have been prescient in kind of predicting where music was going to end up, merging of cultures, looping-based rhythms, samples being a really heavy influence, it was hardly the only thing to be going at that at the same time. It was sort of more several people were coming to the same conclusions because of the technology that was made available to them. So for the first time, things like tape and turntable technology that allowed people to take other sound sources and use them as instruments were finally becoming prevalent and more widespread in the late 70s and the early 80s. So My Life in the Bush of Ghosts stands more as an album that was utilizing those techniques, and albeit while one of the first albums to do so, it was hardly the only album to do so at the time. Nowadays, it's very common to hear things that have looping electronic rhythms, samples, merging of other cultural influences into those songs, often in the same album or on the same track. This album, My Life in the Bush of Ghosts, was re-released in 2006 in a remastered format, so it's one of those things that now is being appreciated probably more than it was at the time. It's still a very interesting artifact. I highly recommend listening to the album. It basically foreshadows a lot of the music that we would come to know in the 80s, the 90s, and now. So, yeah, that's my presentation on My Life in the Bush of Ghosts. I hope you enjoyed it. Have a good one.